BSides DC 2016 videos are brought to you by clearedjobs.net and cybersecjobs.com, tools for your next career move, and Antietam Technologies, focusing on advanced cyber detection, analysis, and mitigation.
Good morning. Thank you, BSides, for having us and putting this on. Our talk's going to be called Adversarial Post-Exploitation, Lessons from the Pros. We're going to go over a lot of really interesting stuff here today. We're going to focus on kind of introduction on what adversary emulation is and what red teaming is and how we apply it in the services space. Lessons from bad guys. We're going to go through a bunch of different APT examples and malicious pieces of malware that we found and talk about how we can study them to better emulate bad guys on engagements. We're going to go through each feature at a technical level, go through the malware reverse engineering of it, what we discovered and how we apply that, as well as kind of a very broad overview of the defense. I'm Justin Warner. I'm the manager of offensive services here at the Adaptive Threat Division. So here, a whole bunch of us up here. I'm a former Air Force guy. I spent a lot of time in the DoD, about 5 years, a lot of time, right? And then I transitioned to the commercial sector where I do consulting now. I'm a Fairfax County volunteer EMT, so if there's any fire rescue volunteers, hi. Chris?
My name is Chris Ross. I've been a part of A2D for just about 2 years. I'm also involved with Python Empire, and I'm a former sysadmin.
So inspiration for this talk, I saw a talk by Richard Wartell a long time ago, it was a couple of years ago at BSides Chicago, and his talk was called Malware is Hard, Let's Go Shopping. And the generic theme of the talk was diving deep into supposedly very advanced bad guys' malware sample to look at the different mistakes they make and then how we can learn from them. So I really like the idea of a mix of a technical talk where you're diving deep into these samples, as well as kind of applying the big broad overview, as well as many of the different offensive tool sets that have come out over the past couple of years. So MacRaber's PowerSploit project, BDF proxy, Mimikittens, all these different tools that are based on techniques that are being leveraged by real-world bad guys in breach scenarios. And it inspired me to kind of look at what we could do better from the other side. And then lots of red team engagements. So in the 2 years, I've been on numerous red team engagements for commercial and top Fortune companies. And you learn a lot. In each engagement, you kind of take away a different lesson learned and a different skill or technique that was never heard about before, or never really been publicized, or a way to do it that's not previously known. And in these engagements, you really learn a lot. So before we go too deep, we want to give you a good intro or overview about really what we're talking about. So first we have to start with what is an adversary, and that's kind of the other guy on the other side of the playing field. This is if you're a blue team, this is the red team, or if the red team, it's the blue team. Or in the real world, this is either nation states or criminals or kids in a basement or any sort of asymmetric threat that might be out there. Then what is the threat? It's that thing that it's the source of the harm. So both source and means. And there's a wide range of different adversaries. So when you talk about red teaming or adversary emulation, you're not really just focusing on super advanced like nation state level threat. That could be one aspect of it. So there's obviously APTs like these guys. Notice the middle picture is MacRaber. He's APT. There's also APTs like these guys. So these are real world threats to environments. They might be it might be a DDoS. It might be a script kiddie in a basement. But because of the means of warfare or the means of computers these days, it gives them a unique advantage that makes them a real power in an environment. And so when you talk about adversary emulation, it's a form or subcategory of red teaming is how I like to think of it. It's a specific kind of red teaming focused on modeling a very realistic known threat. And so you're utilizing intelligence that is either public or private to model this adversary. You're trying to both model their behaviors and objectives all the way down to their low-level techniques or malware or ways that they do things. There are obviously a lot of benefits to this approach. So, it's very measurable. You can actually tie your direct actions to something that's been done in the wild, which answers a lot of questions from execs and different decision makers. But also there's some notable weaknesses that are introduced. And so when you're forced to model a specific adversary, you risk of handcuffing the red team. So part of red teaming is being creative and flexible and learning in the engagement to adapt and change. When you're trying to model an adversary, if you do that, if you flex and adapt, you might deviate from that model or that threat model, in which case you risk kind of straying outside of what you were intending on doing. And so some of these weaknesses are worth noting. This depends on what the end goal or what the objective is in the different engagements. as there's no real framework for adversary emulation or ways to model adversaries, I kind of like to look at defensive frameworks or tools. So there's something called the diamond model, which is essentially, it's a mathematical model. It's used both mathematically as well as kind of in a generic concept. But it basically states that for every intrusion event, there's an adversary taking a step towards an intended goal by using a capability with an infrastructure against the victim. So it breaks out and characterizes adversaries into kind of 4 different components. And so we're going to talk a lot about tools today and capabilities and techniques, but there's other aspects of adversary emulation that you have to be aware of when you're actually doing this threat modeling. Things like, are you using a similar type of infrastructure or the same infrastructure as them? Not necessarily IP addresses, but let's say they use DigitalOcean during their operations. Can you use DigitalOcean? Adversaries, what adversary are you trying to become, and what victims are you going after with what objectives? Post-exploitation, I want to make sure I highlight and call this out. This is one of the biggest phases during red team and adversary emulation engagements. And so oftentimes in our engagements, they can be weeks to months to half a year long. And in that case, we want to make sure that we are often in the network within the first week, meaning that we're spending 4 to 5 months moving around the environment, targeting different objectives, and working through different phases. And so post-exploitation is probably the most consequential phase during these engagements. It's where the most of the intelligence gathering is conducted. It's where you're actually obtaining and getting your objectives, as well as demonstrating that impact and providing the training to different blue team members, which is the ultimate goal of these engagements. It's not just show there are vulnerabilities, that's one aspect of it, but it's also provide training as well as show the risk of a breach in an environment. Before we go too much deeper, we're the dog, and the bad guy's the turtle. And so we're going to write off all the work that they've done, and we're going to heavily focus on stealing their ideas or learning from them so that we don't have to go innovate as often. Innovation can be really awesome, but it can be expensive in resources and time and money and researchers. So if you can study a sample or a specific breach analysis, why not just replicate some of the activity you've seen there? Again, relax. Somebody's already done the work for you. That's the beauty of being a red teamer.
So when focusing on threat emulation, it really pushes you to understand what's going on underneath these different samples and techniques. And I think as testers, we generally have an idea that we practice threat emulation on engagements when really we're modeling ourselves after a general threat. So this is just a general overview of our process for threat emulation, and I'll talk about each of these in the following slides. So where can we see some of this cool stuff? I know myself personally, I like to look at threat reports to find new cool ideas to implement. And also some of the times these reports are more so marketing material than actual technical documentation, which is unfortunate. But really that's what we're looking for, a detailed sort of map of where we need to go to implement this technique. And then when it comes to analyzing or looking at these samples, you want to lean on the technical documentation that you acquired previously and use that to kind of walk you through the code or walk you through what you can look at in IDA Pro to find specifically what you're looking for and how to implement it. And I definitely recommend Practical Malware Analysis to anyone who's interested in reverse engineering. It's a great book. There's a lot of hands-on labs, and you'll definitely take away something from it. And we won't do this to you. We're not going to show you just a random screenshot of some IDA Pro output and expect you to gain much from it. I think it's really cheesy when companies do that. So when looking at alternatives, the great thing is that there's almost always a POC or some open source project that is available on GitHub or Rohit Labs or somewhere else for you to use as a base for your project for development. I think that's a great thing, and it allows you to quickly or rapidly develop your POC for the technique you want to implement. So when it comes to implementation, I think the level of difficulty depends on how well you want to replicate what this threat was doing or what this group was doing in their technique. Whether you want to definitely focus on true threat replication, or do you want to take what they did and sort of modify it and apply it to a general or generic solution. And definitely you want to live off the land, and that's what brings us to why we love PowerShell so much. I think nowadays whenever you see a new tool released, 9 times out of 10 you can say it was implemented in PowerShell. And for me, the biggest benefits are just direct access to the Windows API, and it's default installed on Windows 7 and above. And just a little disclaimer, all these tools that we've written are strictly POC, and we don't really plan on providing active support for some of them after this talk. So we're going to ignore your Git issues. And make sure you understand the code and use them at your own risk, and even contribute if you can.
So I'm going to go back. It's a huge pet peeve. The screenshot at the bottom is someone running code right off of GitHub. Don't do that. Know your code, or else we'll put message boxes in them so you get pop-ups on every app you use. We've totally not done that. So the first example we're going to cover was inspired by an adversary or a tool that we saw going around the wild. A lot of the old school Trojans you see running around, things from late 90s or early thousands, it's all the rage to like get webcam and microphone access, right? Like that's the sexiest thing you can do is access someone's webcam and take a snapshot of them and get this really juicy picture of them playing WoW or something. And it's really impressive. Now, you might think it's kind of silly because you're like, well, what value does that actually have to a sophisticated adversary? But there's a lot of intelligence that can be gained or learned from a microphone recording of you, depending on what time or where you're at, as well as the webcam image. So we start by kind of looking at these examples. The example we're going to dive into for the microphone recording is called LuxNet Rat. It's an old school Trojan, similar to like, Sub 7 or Backorphus that was running around, very commodity in its nature, but it provided the ability to issue commands to a multimedia interface, which allowed you to kind of dump WAV files and gain control of the microphone, which we'll dive into a little bit deeper. And then for the webcam specific capability, we're going to dive into an adversary known as Rocket Kitten. They have a tool called MPK Shell, which is kind of their lightweight backdoor, very simple in nature. However, it uses a set of API calls called VFW, Video for Windows, to access and control the webcam that we're going to dive deep into. So for MCI, basically what the malware sample did, so when you tore apart LuxNet and when you looked at it, essentially the bad guys controlling it were simply sending commands to something called the multimedia command interface. It's basically an abstraction layer over all the different devices that your computer uses. Most people don't even know it's there. It's built into Windows. It's built to help developers or programmers control those different devices. And so by simply sending command strings to that abstraction layer, it'll handle the back-end control of the devices for you. You don't need to do anything device specific or independent. So when we were looking at an engagement one time, we were like, hey, we think it would be really cool to both demo this to the customer as well as see what we can gain by utilizing microphone capture. Got approvals, went through everything. We devved up this capability that used this technique. And so it would send individual strings to that abstraction layer to essentially drop a recording WAV file to disk and then allow you to download it and close the recording. Very simple, requires like 4 different API calls to do. And very little chance of error here as the abstraction layer is going to handle any faults or errors for you. As far as the video capability with Rocket Kitten, what they were doing is they were essentially using the VFW libraries inside of Windows to control a capture window. And so they would instantiate a capture window on the system, and then they would send commands to that capture window to get the drivers, get the description, and issue a recording in that hidden capture window. And then they would disconnect the driver, and that would result in a recording being written out the disk. And now we're going to talk about how much that hurt us going forward. So when researching alternatives, for the video stuff, it was really easy to find. We went to Microsoft's website and we're like, what else is there? There has to be more native capability to access these different devices. And one of the first things we see is many of its features have been superseded by DirectX. And it's like, oh, dang it, Rocket Kitten. Like they're using old school like superseded capabilities. And we'll show you why. But essentially the biggest alternative was just use DirectX. It's built for this very reason. And there's a whole bunch of libraries and supports in different languages. And so we consider that. For audio, we analyzed a lot of different tools. So when I was going through all this piece of commodity malware, it's like the least fun thing for reverse engineers to sit and stare at commodity malware all day. And I spent about 2 days going through different samples, hoping to find some different method of doing microphone capture. Fortunately, the majority of them use the Windows Multimedia Library or in MCI. And so I didn't really find other ways, although DirectX, and we've considered other methods that would be just as usable. So the resulting capability and the big picture takeaway for us was on that op where we actually ran into this situation, We were able to mock up this capability. We called it Get Microphone Audio in PowerShell. It's actually supported to the PowerSploit dev branch, so this is one that will be supported, unlike most of the others. And it used the WinMCI to issue those calls and dump a WAV file to disk. The big picture takeaway is we were able to take this LuxNet route, which we studied in depth, reverse engineered it, figured out how they did it, and then directly mock it up for use during a red team engagement. And so when the customer says, you guys were dumping audio from disk, how were you doing that, or why were you doing that? You could cite and tell them, let them know that you're emulating a real bad guy that does this in the wild. In this case, you might wonder, what does audio get you? Well, when you're sitting in a call center, or you're targeting a call center, or a network operations center, or a security operations center, and they're handling trouble tickets, or various different of customer support, or administering systems, audio gets you a lot. You can hear a lot of really juicy details, and you can learn a lot about the network by listening to voices rather than relying on pure IP addresses and scans and Nessus and all the different types of telemetry that penetration testers and red teamers are used to. The really big downside of this capability is that there is no compression. Wah, wah. So when you're using WinMCI and you're dumping these WAV files, they are giant. And so if you're working under strict operational security concerns, it's not encrypted, it's a WAV file on disk, and they're rather large. And so you're going to have to chunk it up and exfil it out, potentially in a little bit stealthier way than if you were to get good compression or MP4, some other method. For the Rocket Kitten mockup, we had a lot of fun with this one. I spent a lot of time playing with their MPK shell on a dev system. And I built a logically similar mockup. And so I actually got it to the point where it was exact APIs called in the exact order that the adversary toolkit was, with the exact flags and arguments and everything, almost a line-for-line replication in the PowerShell of what their toolkit did. But every time I ran it, I would get a pop-up as the user, which is not the goal of a red teamer, by the way, is to get a user pop-up. And it would always ask me to select the device. And I'm like, man, maybe this is why Microsoft superseded this. It turns out that VFW, when you're using a VM with a generic driver that handles all of that different multimedia, including your camera, the VFW doesn't know what device to use. And even when trying to specify it, it doesn't take it real well. So either I'm a really bad programmer, or I just couldn't figure it out, and the Rocket Kitten actors didn't figure it out either, because after playing with their toolkit enough, I realized it did the exact same thing. It caused a giant user pop-up. And so I put this out on GitHub for release. The GitHub's going to be dropped right after the talk, so you can see these different samples, but I don't recommend using this in a real-world engagement. Instead, use this one. So we went with Microsoft's advice after failing at the VFW stuff. We went ahead and we found .NET assemblies that already implemented direct show and DirectX capabilities, so all credit goes to those actors cited here, the different licenses. But we embedded those into our tool, which allowed us to gain that DirectX support straight up in our tool. And so we can use both compression and video tuning with proper frame rates, and we can open up the webcam and audio for capture in a very stealthy manner. Now the light does turn on, so that's a good indicator of compromise if your video light is turning on randomly. But you'd be surprised how many places we've used it with no help desk ticket being submitted. So now the big takeaway for adversary emulation in this case is the actors, what are they using webcams for? Well, they're using it to capture, I don't know, maybe who is at the other end of that keyboard? What are they doing? Where do they live? Is this a residential purchase? Is this a commercial building? For us personally, it works really well in SOCs. Again, you hear me talking about SOCs a lot. These capabilities work really well. It's nice that if you're on a laptop that just happens to be facing the wall of SIM, that's always displayed in every operation center up on the wall. And you can get a nice picture, screenshot of all the SIMs in the background. Gives you a pretty good preview of all their technology, as well as any alerts that are at the top of the list, their Jira tickets, and everything else that's pretty juicy. And this tool's been put out on his GitHub for random PowerShell scripts, and we're going to show a quick demo of it. So this tool, or this demo is going to run for you. Let's see. Let's escape the mode. Ooh, closed. There it is. All right. So the first function we're going to run here, the first part of this is just kind of showing the ability to query the end user system. So you can see here we're able to query and get the different audio inputs that are available on the system. We're able to get the different compression methods that are available on the system. And so this would allow you to be very granular and fine-tune exactly what compression and tools your video and audio is going to record with. So in this case, you can see we have a USB video device and a microphone attached, as well as different compression methods that are available to the actor. And so obviously this is a proof of concept. We're not showing you in weaponized manner. We're in a PowerShell prompt. Again, not probably ideal if you're red teaming, just straight up like RDP'd in or anything. But this is all usable and friendly to name your X hacker tool that you like to use, Cobalt Strike or Metasploit. So in this case, we're going to record a webcam video. It's going to be a record time of 4 seconds with a video compression. And we're going to add audio compression to it as well to kind of keep the size as minimal as possible. And then we're going to slap on reverse because I like to see output from everything. And when it runs, it's going to set all the frame rates set to capture and start it. So at this point, the light would be on and it's capturing video from the end user. And then returns the file object that it's written to out on disk. And so at this point, you could, as the adversary, begin to chunk up and exfil this, or if it's small enough, which in this case it's a fair size, we could just exfil it directly. So just to show you improve, we're going to see Chris Ross's pretty face here in a second. Yay! And so you can see that we were able to record the webcam in a very similar technique, obviously adapted, because in this case we decided that the alternatives were better than the pure threat emulation approach that we could have taken in the previous examples.
Okay, with Skype. So earlier this year, I think in February, Palo Alto released a report giving a detailed account of the T9000 malware sample, and they basically described one of the capabilities for that they had to record Skype conversations and also take screenshots during a Skype call. That really piqued my interest. I thought that'd be something really cool to implement in PowerShell and work on as a project. So how did it go about recording conversations? First, it would start with it'd use the Windows messaging API to send a broadcast message called API Discover to all the windows present on the system. And Skype would respond to that and indicate that it was running, it's here. And then the malware sample would send another message saying API attached, requesting access to the Skype desktop API. And this is when the user will receive the little orange box you see up there, a prompt saying that there's a process trying to gain access to Skype. And unfortunately, there's no way around this, but users are not the brightest people, so they're probably going to click allow access anyway. But once you are allowed access, you'll start to see a flurry of messages from Skype. And you can see from the screenshot, Skype is pretty verbose with its output. So mainly, while Skype is running, the malware sample was looking for a call status ringing message. And once it received that, it would send a message to retrieve the user handle of the other call participant. And then it would move on and wait for a call status in progress message, and it would instruct Skype to redirect the microphone and audio output to a file on disk. And then it would just run in a loop until the call status indicated that it was finished. And then it would just record the call log. So that brought about the Skype recorder tool that we developed. This was definitely something interesting for me to work on. It was a little challenging because this was my first time developing using .NET Reflection in PowerShell. And the entire purpose of this is strictly just intelligence collection. Like if we're able to hook some of these Skype calls and listen in on a conference or meeting minutes, maybe we learn some more information about our environment. So I'll move on to a quick demo. So we see here we import the Skype recorder module, and then we're going to start recording with a duration of 1 minute. And you'll see it creates a window, it has a window handle, and during that time it'll go ahead and send messages to connect to Skype. And we're going to go ahead and start a call with our buddy Echo, the Skype test service. And then once we receive a call status ringing and then call status in progress, it's going to go ahead and try to redirect output to a file. And you'll see there that Skype echoes back and tells you that the output has been set to the file that you specified. And then while the call is in progress, it will give you a message about the duration of the call. And then once the call is finished, it'll wait until the timeout loop is reached to output the location of the files. And there's also some logic built into the tool where if you set the timeout loop to, say, 1 minute and the call lasts for 5 minutes, it'll keep on recording until the call is finished.
So this is really, really useful. I've seen this really useful in engagements and commercial entities that use Skype for their commercial entity. There are numerous of them that actually use Skype for conference calls as well as inter-work messaging. So in that specific case, we walked in. We weren't weaponized or ready for anything with Skype. There's not too many tools that do this in the red team space. And so again, drawing inspiration from the bad guys in order to kind of solve a challenge or overcome an obstacle, as well as, in this case, being able to directly quote or cite the APT that we're working. So almost every red team engagement I've been in, and especially on the first one, I was working with Will Schroeder, another red team at our company, and I walk in, and there's a couple of things he tells me to do at our very first red team. And he tells me to do it by hand, which is like, I hate doing things by hand. Like, hackers are all about hacking and automation. So the first thing he tells me to do by hand are map all of the domain trusts in this environment, and there's like 150 domain trusts all into CSV, and he's like, exploit this. Like, find it. I'm like, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to write something to automate that. The next thing we have to do is just sit and mine file shares endlessly. Every red teamer knows that feeling of just looking through dozens, if not hundreds of file shares in an environment, trying to find that one file that's either going to give you your escalation path or it's going to be the crown jewels just sitting unprotected in a file share ready for the stealing, ready for you to highlight for that customer. So in this case, I was like, why do we have to sit and look at file shares, and why do I have to do this every day to detect changes? There has to be a better way to do this. And so for this specific case, APT30 or Nikon, they're a really solid actor, lots of reporting and documentation on them, which makes them a really good case study for threat emulation. They have a piece of malware called the flash flood malware, which is essentially their host profiler, or their ability to survey an end system and package up a whole bunch of preliminary data for exfiltration from the environment. And so essentially how it works is it uses timestamps to measure changes in an environment, and anything that changes in certain monitored directories automatically get exfilled out to this exfil directory and encrypted, aka obfuscated, using some custom routine that's really, really bad and easy to fix. The things that it specifically gathers is the Windows address books, certain LNK files, anything from removable media, anything from the desktop, temporary internet. It's all the normal stuff that pen testers and red teamers and adversaries are looking at every time they get on a box to try to look for interesting things. And so when you dive down specifically to the monitoring and exfil component, how it works, they use an API call called find first file A, which essentially gives you a pointer to a linked list of all the files in a certain directory. And then they iterate over every file, and every file they get to, they compare a file time to see if that file time is newer than the last time that their tool ran, which is stored in some text file on the back end. If it is, it'll automatically archive it, so it'll wrap it up in its custom compression routine or custom obfuscation routine and exfil it out to this Windows slash files directory or recent files directory, depending on what it is. And then it will continue iterating over. Then the actor will return, take everything in this obfuscated directory, swipe it up, take it out, and remove it. Now the benefit here is most pen testers and red teamers, when they're on an engagement, including us, like, you just maintain access to whatever systems you need access to, and you just keep them calling home, right? Like if you got on a new system, you don't kill your agents every hour, and you don't only do like 30 minutes of ops and clean off and leave it. But when you're operating with operational security concerns, so in some of our tightest red times, we have to be very careful about where we leave agents and how long we're on the system, and we have to be very selective in where we move throughout the network. So in this case, running a tool like this, leaving it behind, and then coming back to get your exfil later is a much better solution that allows you to maintain a more covert presence in the environment. So when looking at different alternate techniques, I like all the asynchronous options, because like sitting there and just constantly iterating over in some timed manner seems kind of silly for me. Like there's this whole eventing thing built into Windows, which is made for this. But so there's the Win32 API, which exposes the find first change notification API call that allows you to set up asynchronous events to watch for stuff like this. Or in .NET, since we're cheating, we're using PowerShell. In .NET, there's the system.io.filewatcher class, or file system watcher class, which will essentially monitor and fire some callback function every time there's a change in the file system in a specific location. There's also WMI events. And then as far as exfiltration or compression, there's all sorts of options. We specifically mentioned the script here, OutTac encrypted store. It's a really, really good option for saving off and encrypting or exfiltrating data. Basically takes everything going into it, encrypts it using AES or RSA, and stores it kind of like a virtual file system. So it's kind of like a VFS on a system. So the end tool that we came up with, really good for file shares. We utilized the previously written start file system monitor tool with some slight tweaks. In this case that we were using this tool on an engagement, we were specifically asked to emulate a threat. So they wanted us to try to model this specific adversary, so APT30. And so in this case, we created a tool set and we created an encryption routine called write-flash-flood file, which it takes in any file off the pipeline or any byte string off the pipeline and outputs it to the proper location with the proper IOCs with the exact crypto routine that APT30 is using. So there's obviously numerous cases or use cases for this. There's adversary emulation. There's, I don't know, maybe misattribution or malware misattributions. Maybe if you're trying to blame somebody else for your work, if you encrypt all your stuff exactly like them and put it in the same place as them, oftentimes analysts will jump to conclusions. That's a pretty good good use for this, as well as just obfuscating things on disk. Again, this is. Their routine is like a very simple like add shift little kung fu. So I don't recommend actually using this on an engagement unless authorized by your customer. It's much better to dump things to disk encrypted, AES, RSA, so it's not going to be picked up, especially if it's anything sensitive. But again, makes a good use case or demo in the case that you're trying to show the effects of a bad guy in the environment. So let's see if we can find it here. So we're going to load up our tool, the Start File System Monitor. This has been tweaked from the version that's on GIST to be specific for our threat emulation scenario here. And then we're going to start monitoring this really secretive directory called I hide things on my desktop. Because, by the way, all the directories we see in real engagements are about that obvious. Now, you notice there's nothing in here yet. So the users just set this up, but they have a text file that they've written in Notepad with all their super secret data, banking passwords, and passwords of Pandora and everything else that they always store on their desktop. So we're going to start our monitoring script, and the user is going to be really lame and drop their password.txt file. And you'll notice that instantly the asynchronous event fires, which notices what's been created, and it exfiltrates it, obfuscated, out to the exact directory that APT30 did. So if you come to that directory, you'll notice the file's there. We're going to open it up and show that it's not exactly plain text. It's a nice random byte string that doesn't make any sense. Then as the bad guy or the red team or whoever we are, we would come back and pick up this file, exfiltrate it, which would be all their sensitive passwords, and then we can read it because we're the ones who wrote the encryption routine. And so we can output all of their secretive data that we've swiped off without them noticing. And so real time, this would get everything that they add, even if they delete it. So if they instantly add it like a temp file, or, oh man, I need to just write this password down real quick, and they delete it because they're really secure against bad guys and they're aware of what they're doing, this would swipe it. It's a race condition, so it depends on if you can beat the milliseconds of asynchronous eventing, but I'd like to bet on Microsoft on that one a couple times out of 10. All right.
So for packet capture, I think that's one of the most useful post-exploitation capabilities that you can have when operating in an environment. There are a lot of different attacks that use packet capture as a base to conduct the attack. For one, WSUS man in the middle, I think that's a really cool technique. Just being able to inject a payload into a WSUS update and have it pushed to a remote host is pretty amazing. And also, there are several APT groups that make use of packet capture for different techniques they implement. For one, Dooku love to drop the WinPCAP driver and do a hot install and use a virtual file system to inject MDNS replies. So how WinPCAP works, usually it's a pretty dirty installation. You'll have to drop all the required DLLs and also the required driver and use SE to create a service and start that service for WinPCAP. And then you'll be able to utilize all the WinPCAP functions to capture traffic to your heart's desire. So what other research is out there? For one, Invoke Convey, it's a tool written by Kevin Robinson. It's a great tool for spoofing attacks, specifically WPAD spoofing attacks. It uses raw sockets to capture traffic and respond to SMB or DNS or NetBIOS requests. And then also there's some work done by Alex from Deco or Killswitch GUI. He wrote pure packet capture in C++ inside of a reflective DLL. So it's pretty great work.
Another thing I've seen a lot of is when reversing all these different samples of examples of this, one of the favorite techniques that I saw implemented by different actors in different reports was the Windows filtering platform drivers, which is essentially a driver that's supposed to be a middle abstraction layer that you can install. It does require code signing, but we've all seen that code signing certificates get stolen. And so if these actors are able to get their hands on one, they can sign their own driver that is built to basically intercept network packet capture. The other one is ETW, a little known feature inside of Windows. It's built for event tracing. It's meant for debugging and administration, but it exposes a huge amount of functionality to access back-end data on a system, including network traces. So you can actually, to some degree, record and store off network traces, all using a native built-in tool in the environment.
So that's what brought about Get WinPCAP Capture, the PowerShell tool. It utilizes some .NET libraries to craft packets and conduct packet capture. It also takes care of the hot install of the WinPCAP drivers and also uninstall. You can set the size limit for the amount of data you want to, or packets you want to capture, and also a timeout. So then I'll move to a quick demo. So you see here first we're checking to see if the NPF service is installed, and it's not. So we'll go ahead and use the tool. We'll import the WinPCAP capture and install the WinPCAP drivers. And currently it uses sc.exe to install this, or to create and install the service. We have plans in the future to change that to use pure.NET reflection. And once it's set up, we can use the main function get WinPCAP capture. And we're going to capture over port 80 and set the max size to 5 megs. And then we're going to capture over a plain text protocol, someone logging into Harmdrow's website, which is pretty awesome.
Totally not a vulnerability. I got approval for this.
And then once it's finished, it'll output the location of the PCAP file. And you can use the same script to uninstall the NPF service and clean up. And then we can just go ahead and open up that file with Wireshark. And then we see the clear text login for the site.
That's his face again, yes. So I'd like to also note on this one that I've seen the most use out of something like this in a lot of like finance industry. You know, there's a lot of regulatory protocols that control the use of plain text protocols, but you'll note that a lot of those protocols or a lot of those specific compliance things are about traffic over the boundary or things leaving the environment. However, there's this thing where bad guys get inside your environment and they don't need the boundary anymore. And so if there's situations or systems or credit processing or financial processing or core banking or any of those other really good buzzwords that utilize plain text protocols, this is a really good method to directly rip off of a bad guy, to dump those financial transactions, just clear text into a PCAP and improve access to that data, all without having to get on the mainframes, which I hate touching anyway, stay far away from. So we kind of feel it's an obligation. We try very hard to give mitigations or defensive talk on everything we do because our job as red teamers especially is to help better and train and improve the state of the industry and try to offer suggestions. Is the world ending? No. I would say it is very, very hard to find a trick or a mitigation for a lot of these different post-exploitation activities. In each of these cases, there are indicators and things that could have been locked down to prevent this from occurring. However, I would say that it's kind of the focus oftentimes when we release these tools, so we come up here and we do this talk and we show you everything in PowerShell, right? The number one thing we get after a talk like this is like, I'm deleting PowerShell from my environment. I'm like, don't let our proof of concepts just trick you. This can all be done in native code too, and this can all be done with built-in tools. So we don't want you to think that PowerShell is the enemy. I would say that the core thing here, the issues is in the words of a very, very wise senior red teamer, Matt Nelson, users are going to use. And so most often what adversaries are exploiting is that user. They're using user behavior and they're using admin behavior in situations where they're supposed to be able to do it. And the real focus should be on auditing and detection. Because after an adversary gets admin in your environment and they're doing admin things, oftentimes the thing that's going to trip you off is admin things that don't normally happen in your environment. Let's say the admin normally takes a 2-hour lunch, and instead of his 2-hour lunch, it looks like he's working through lunch. Maybe you should ask the question why. Or I don't know if they're logging in at 2 in the morning from a VPN or any number of every time you read a breach report, you're like, how did no one notice this? This is very odd behavior. But it's easy in hindsight 2020. But the auditing and real-time capture of all this, kind of the indice best practices are going to help you. One of the best blogs I like to recommend, and I absolutely love this post, I think it's extremely underrated, is the Maslow's Hierarchy of Security Controls, written by Lee Holmes over at Microsoft. Basically, the concept is if you're installing 15 next-gen agents to solve all the security in your network, but you don't have AV or whitelisting, maybe you should take a step back. And maybe you should build the foundation of your network security and defense in the right order and step it up in an appropriate manner. Focus on the basics first, the basics of detection. Have a SOC, have a team that's trained to respond, and then you can start installing the tools that will empower that team to do their job. We often get asked the new buzzword or the new favorite thing to say is threat hunting, right? Everyone's heard it. We want to hunt. We want to hunt in our environment. And that's awesome. I'm a big fan of it. I kind of go back to or boil this down to a very simple principle. So low cards exchange, essentially it's a traditional forensics principle. It's been applied to digital forensics as well. It essentially says that every contact leaves a trace. There's always trace evidence. Every time an actor enters your environment, no matter how sexy and sophisticated they are, no matter how many billions of dollars they've spent on a tool, there is an artifact left somewhere. It's impossible not to leave an artifact somewhere. However, the trick is are you looking for the artifacts? Right? And so that's essentially what threat hunting is going to proactively look for and identify artifacts. And so I'm a big fan of it. I think if it's applied in the right way and it's focused on the people aspect, not just installing a bunch of tools that do things, but trained analysts that use those tools and know how to organize an engagement, I think it can be very helpful. The majority of times we've been caught on engagement, yes, we get caught. That's the job of the red team. The majority of the times we get caught are either users, because we do something really bad and they notice, or we intend to get caught, or IR people that are being proactive. They're digging through SIM data because they enjoy their job. And while digging through SIM data, they notice something odd. Versus just sitting and waiting for the big giant red alert, like nuclear alarm to go off in the SOC, which rarely happens in an adversary that knows the environment. So what's the big takeaways from here? Well, hopefully some really cool tools you can go play with and some ideas. Realistic threat replication must model threats. And so a lot of people say they do threat rep, but are you modeling a generic threat, or are you modeling a specific threat? Or have you even asked that question? Because when you start talking about applying the appropriate level of threat for the environment, it doesn't always mean being super advanced APT. Sometimes it means modeling a ransomware threat to see how the environment would respond. Now, all of the threat replication relies on realistic tactics and intel and observed techniques, which is the hard part in this industry, because it's so hard to get your hands on a detailed postmortem analysis of the majority of breaches. One of my favorite talks was, it was No Easy Breach, I think is what it was titled. It was talked about at DerbyCon. And it was essentially a walkthrough of Mandiant and how they did this giant IR, and it was like a major battle back and forth with this adversary trying to fight for control in an environment. And it's a really great postmortem for people to be able to learn how to replicate those threats. There's plenty of creative things. So all of you who have used screenshot and keyloggers, and that's it on your engagements, think outside the box. Like, there are so many different things you can do to collect intel from a user that is powerful beyond those two simple techniques. So expand your horizons, get creative, go out and study bad guys and how they're doing it, and then go create that. And then my favorite line, and I always tell our new guys this, is OPSEC is never perfect. I shouldn't even say rarely. So that trace evidence that you're going to leave behind as a bad guy, both understand what you're leaving behind, and for the blue teamers, understand what the bad guys leave behind. So red needs to learn a little bit of blue, and blue needs to learn a little bit of red to better everybody's skill sets. So we got a bunch of malware references. We're going to put these slides up on SlideShare and release them, but there's a bunch of malware references for the specific hashes and reports that we talked about in here if you want to check out like how we modeled it or how close it was. So these are kind of reference material. At this point, open up for questions. I think we have about 5 minutes, and then we'll be out back. We have a table out back, and then we'll be around for any other questions. Go ahead. Great question. He's trying to stump me. By the way, I worked with this guy, so he's just trying to troll me. Post-exploitation in Linux. So it's a great question. We're heavy PowerShell people. You'll see that. We also model a tool called Python Empire, which has been since rolled into Empire. We have an entire rat that we've built and released in Linux and Mac, which is built to do just that. So it's focused on post-exploitation modules written for those tool sets. You'll notice that a lot of adversaries, like they have toolkits in Linux and Mac, but they're a lot harder to find because there are less of them. I would say it's because 9 out of the top 10 like commercial organizations use Active Directory, and therefore they use a majority of Windows. We have operated in 90% Mac environments and successfully conducted post-exploitation. So it's doable. It's just as doable as anywhere else. You just got to know where to draw your inspiration and how to code the tools. Questions? No? All right, either that was a really good presentation or you're all sleeping. Yeah.